Good afternoon. Today is January 30th. Welcome to a briefing of the Ways and Means Committee. I would like to just first announce for folks that are watching and folks that are here live in the committee room, there will be folks going in and out on the committee because a group of individuals have a joint hearing that they're going to have to go to. I have a list of folks that have to go testify on bills. So I do recognize that people will be in and out during this briefing. But let's get started on our briefing on electronic ballot return. During the last session, the committee directed the Department of Legislative Services to complete a study on the issue of electronic ballot return. Today, we will be briefed on the results of the study. The vice chair and I oversaw the study. DLS, the Department of Legislative Services, conducted a thorough and objective study of all aspects of the issues of electronic ballot return as we instructed. The goal of the study was not to make recommendations, but to provide the committee with the best information as we consider this important issue moving forward. We will also hear from an expert in the field of electronic voting and the state administrator of elections who will provide additional insights. We look forward to an informative presentation. And with that, I would like to ask Mr. Stan Ward, Stan the man. Whenever you're ready, we can begin. And Benjamin Voigt and Dominic Giuliani could introduce themselves to the committee. I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Ben Voigt, DLS, and Committee Counsel for the Environment and Transportation Committee.
Dominic Giuliani, Department of Legislative Services, Bill Drafting, and Policy Analyst.
And committee, the presentation is on the website for your information, or you could be like Delegate Hartman and your staff has printed it out for you.
All right, well, thank you, Madam Chair. So we're happy to present the findings of our study. I will just begin. So this is just an outline of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to do a brief definition of what is electronic ballot return. We're going to look at military and overseas voters and voters with disabilities, which are the groups that are proposed for electronic return. We're going to look at other states, litigation, potential advantages and disadvantages, and also alternatives to electronic return should you choose to consider them. So first, what is electronic return? So that is the return of voted ballots to election officials by electronic methods, usually through the internet. This is distinct from the use of electronic methods to deliver blank ballots to voters. So Maryland, as you know, already allows all voters to receive and mark blank ballots online. Maryland does not allow any voters to return voted ballots electronically, however. In Maryland, if you receive a ballot electronically or mark it electronically, it must be printed out and mailed to the election officials to be counted. So first, we're going to look at military and overseas voters. So there's a federal law that helps military and overseas voters cast ballots. This applies to members of the United States Uniformed Services and Merchant Marine while they're away from home on active duty and their spouses and dependents. It also covers United States citizens residing outside the United States. Among other things, this law requires that military and overseas voters have the option to receive their blank ballot electronically if they choose. However, the federal law does not require states to allow a military or overseas voter to return a voted ballot electronically. That's a decision that's left up to state legislatures. So this just gives some data on the number of military and overseas voters who have participated in recent Maryland elections. So the next few slides are about voters with print disabilities, and Ben will be presenting these.
Okay, thank you. So we're now going to learn more about what is a print disability. The National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled at the Library of Congress provides services to individuals who are unable to read or use regular print materials as a result of temporary or permanent visual or physical limitations. This includes those who are blind or have another disability that prevents reading or handling print materials. So as you can see, a print disability is not composed of an exact severity or a definite number of disabilities. Some people may only have it temporarily, like an individual recovering from a stroke for a short period. This makes finding data particularly difficult, and the Department of Disabilities does not have data on this. That being said, there is some information out there. The Census Bureau primarily collects data on disabilities through the American Community Survey. This is Maryland data from 2021 and was gathered by asking respondents whether they have serious difficulty seeing even when wearing glasses for vision disabilities. And then for the self-care disability question, the survey asks whether they have difficulty bathing or dressing. And these are two data categories that are most likely to compose a large portion of individuals who may also have print disabilities. For example, if you have difficulty dressing, you could potentially also have a print disability. And I did not total these numbers though, because a respondent can report more than one disability type.
Okay, so now we're going to look at electronic return in other states. So this shows the number of states that authorize electronic return for different categories of voters. So the total number of states that have some form of electronic ballot return is 34. All of those states allow it for military and overseas voters. Of those 34 states, there are 13 that also authorize it for voters with disabilities. And then there's 4 states that allow electronic return for some other category of voters, such as perhaps first responders. So one thing to note about this is that of the states that authorize electronic ballot return, almost all of them did so before 2016 when the Russian government attacked our elections. The only state to have newly authorized electronic return since 2016 is the state of Michigan, which has yet to implement it. So this looks at the different methods of electronic return that states authorize. So fax, email, and web portal. So the email would just be the ballot and any accompanying documents would just be returned as email attachments. A fax could be a traditional telephone line fax or sent through the internet. And then web portals is on a website for returning voted ballots. So this chart shows the different methods of electronic return that states authorize. So 32 states authorize return by fax, 27 by email, and 11 by web portal. And some states, of course, authorize multiple methods. So this looks at military and overseas voters in 2022 nationwide and how they returned their ballots that year. So 62% returned by postal mail, 25% by email, and 13% by some other method, usually fax. So these slides are about litigation, and Ben will present these.
Thank you. Okay. So we're now going to look at disputes over absentee voting and electronic ballot returns and how they've played out in the courts. First, we will discuss the general legal framework for electronic ballot return court cases. Plaintiffs are typically those with print disabilities like blindness or motor issues. And then the defendants are typically state or local election authorities. Relief is most often sought under Title II of the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which both prohibit discrimination by public entities in similar ways. The core of most of the claims is this, that the plaintiffs allege that the failure to provide an accommodation for absentee voting requires disabled individuals to rely on assistance from others, which prevents voters from voting absentee privately and independently in the same way as those without print disabilities. Okay, so for relief, plaintiffs must show that the plaintiff has a disability, such as a print disability, that the defendant is a public entity, like a state board of elections, that the plaintiff is qualified to benefit from a government program. So being an eligible voter and eligible to vote absentee. The fourth element is whether the program is protected by the ADA. The fifth is whether the plaintiff was denied meaningful access to the program on the basis of their disability. And then last is whether a reasonable modification is available. And the last row here, that's where most of the dispute is about. And we'll cover those on the next slides. So starting with what program is protected, this was explained in National Federation of the Blind versus Lamone, a federal case in 2016 involving the former State Board of Elections administrator. This case held that the ADA provides disability protections not just for broad public programs like voting generally, but also for specific services, programs, or activities. This includes programs within voting, like absentee voting programs or early voting. This case provided much of the analysis and precedent that has since been used by disability rights organizations. The Lamone case also provided guidance on the next element, which is meaningful access. In this case, plaintiff's argument was that the defendants have provided a benefit to non-disabled voters while denying that same benefit to plaintiffs on the basis of their disability. Any option offered to all voters must be accessible to all voters. It is not a defense to argue that another method offered is accessible, like in-person voting. After determining that the plaintiffs have been denied meaningful access, the court in Lamone then considered whether there is a reasonable modification that will provide meaningful access to the program. Defendant is not required, however, to make modifications that fundamentally alter the program or impose an undue hardship. A number of arguments are raised by defendants, like there are other accessible ways to vote, like voting in person, but as we learned, each component of a state's voting program must be accessible. If an injunction is sought, there's usually a higher standard for relief. Accommodations would impose an undue hardship or fundamentally alter the nature of the service. And then last, there is election security. When determining whether electronic ballot return is a reasonable modification to a state's absentee voting program, the court considers what type of absentee voting program is in place for military and overseas voters in the state. This is because expanding electronic return to voters with disabilities is less burdensome when it's already implemented for military and overseas voters. The relief plaintiffs achieve usually tracks the state's policy for military and overseas voters. And Maryland does not allow electronic return for any voters, so a court is unlikely to find that electronic return is a reasonable modification of absentee voting on this basis. So relief varies by state, but most legal actions brought by plaintiffs were successful in receiving some relief, like electronic ballot delivery, but not necessarily electronic ballot return. Cases often ended in settlements as well. Next, we look at two federal cases that resolve disputes surrounding absentee voting and electronic return. Taliaferro was a plaintiff that was part of a coalition bringing this action with other disability rights organizations. At the time of this case, absentee ballots had to be filled out on paper and physically returned to the Board of Elections. And the plaintiffs alleged that the failure to provide an accommodation prevented print-disabled voters from voting privately and independently in the same way as voters without a print disability, violating the ADA. Plaintiffs requested the ability to use the same electronic voting method as military and overseas voters. And so, following the guidance of Lamone, the court found that plaintiffs are denied meaningful access to absentee voting and reasonable modifications are available because per their own state board of elections, implementing an accessible system was feasible in 5 weeks. Electronic ballot return was already available for military and overseas voters, and security concerns did not outweigh private and independent voting. The court ended up requiring the state to allow voters with vision disabilities to opt into the electronic voting platform used by the uniformed and overseas voters, allowing them to return ballots electronically. In this case, New York's existing absentee voting program required voters to fill out a paper ballot by hand. Plaintiffs were unable to independently mark a ballot due to their disabilities, and the program provided no alternatives This allegedly denied them meaningful access to absentee voting. The court, however, found that implementing a new absentee voting program across the state would cause an undue hardship with 2 months until the election. Ultimately, the parties in this case reached a settlement, though, and this allowed voters to electronically request and receive and mark a ballot, but it did not provide for electronic ballot return.
Okay, now we're going to shift gears and we're going to look at some potential advantages of electronic return. And those include the potential for increased voter turnout, the potential for improved access for military and overseas voters, and improved access for voters with print disabilities. And these slides will be presented by Dominic.
Okay, so there have been countries that have experimented with e-voting before. So regarding increased turnout, Estonia, which is a small country in Europe, passed a bill allowing electronic voting in 2002. As such, increased voter turnout was noticed in a variety of elections since the implementation of that bill. There was a 3.7% increased turnout in parliamentary elections between 2003 to 2007, a 17.1% increased turnout in the European Union parliamentary elections between 2004 and 2009, and a 13.2% increased turnout in local elections between 2005 and 2009. Notwithstanding the electronic voting legislation, there have been other factors that could have contributed to the increased turnout, such as voter interest in politics, which ebbs and flows over time. Many studies have pointed out the inconclusive effect electronic voting has on voter turnout. In some instances, voters are swapping voting by mail with electronic voting, which in the end neither increased nor decreased voter turnout. In some countries that allowed electronic voting for a period of time, there was either no change in turnout since that electronic voting implementation began, and at times there was even a decrease in that turnout. In other instances, countries that allowed electronic voting nonetheless had low voter turnout overall following an election. Electronic voting has shown an increase in voter turnout for military and overseas voters, however, in some states. In the US, many states offer residents who are classified as military overseas voters to use electronic ballot returns. Between 2018 and 2020, the states that offered electronic ballot returns to those voters saw a 3% increase in the elections during that time period. Another example is in West Virginia, 18 counties allowed registered expatriate voters to use a mobile app to electronically return their ballots. So as such, there was a 3 to 5% increase in those voters turning out for the 2018 US midterm elections. And the next slides will be presented by Stan.
So this slide is about improved access for voters with disabilities. So as you know, many voters with print disabilities may not be able to mail a paper absentee ballot without assistance. Electronic return would allow some voters with print disabilities to return a voted absentee ballot to election officials independently without requiring the assistance of another individual. Election officials would still have to remake the ballot on standard ballot paper before it could be scanned and counted. Electronic ballot return would also eliminate the risk that the voter's selections would be revealed to an individual assisting a voter with mailing the ballot. But the secrecy of the voter's ballot would still be at high risk of being violated during the electronic return process, and we'll discuss more about that in a moment. So now we're going to look at potential disadvantages of electronic return. Those include insecurity, loss of voter privacy, and loss of public confidence in elections. So first, we're going to look at how voting is different from other online transactions that we do every day. First is ballot secrecy. How an individual votes has to remain secret. This makes it much more difficult to verify that votes were counted accurately. Secrecy is not needed for online commercial transactions. So, for example, very simply, if you have a false statement on your bank account, you can verify that. You can see that. It can be corrected. With voting, that we don't have a record showing how the ballot was actually, that your ballot was actually counted correctly. Another difference is high stakes. Obviously, elections have enormous consequences that are not comparable to any other transactions that we complete online. Another difference is very low tolerance for error. Obviously, commercial transactions, there's a certain level of fraud and error that occurs that we accept. That's not acceptable in elections. Every legitimate vote has to be counted, and any illegitimate votes have to be rejected. Another major difference is the lack of an opportunity for correction. For practical and legal reasons, it's very difficult or impossible to rerun an election if it's tainted by online ballot fraud. Most online transactions can easily be corrected if fraud or error occurs. So there's 4 major risks of electronic ballot return, security risks. The first is malware on voters' devices. Malware is prevalent on many smartphones and computers that would be used to return ballots electronically. The malware may be undetectable. Many voters' devices could be compromised by malware. Another risk is denial of service attacks. So these attacks could target a particular area or demographic group and potentially alter the outcome of an election. And as we've seen, it's very difficult to rerun an election. Voter impersonation. There's no widely available method for reliably verifying voters' identities over the internet. Without reliable identification of voters, widespread fraud is possible. And then finally, ballot interception. Ballots transmitted over the internet could be intercepted by an attacker and altered or deleted. And this interference may be undetectable and uncorrectable even if detected. So this slide is about comparing the security risks between internet voting and traditional voting methods, including in-person and mail-in. So on the one hand, with internet voting, an attack altering thousands or even millions of votes is feasible. With traditional voting, a large-scale attack is very difficult. With internet voting, a large-scale attack may be carried out by a small number of individuals or even one individual. With traditional voting, a large-scale attack would require the cooperation of many individuals. With internet voting, an attack may be undetectable. With traditional voting, a large-scale attack is likely to be detected and thwarted. And then finally, with internet voting, attackers may be located anywhere in the world, including in a country where they won't be punished for the crime. With traditional voting methods, the attacker would have to be located in the United States, where they would risk punishment. So the next few slides are expert statements on internet voting. So the first one comes from the National Academy of Sciences. This was a consensus report that was issued in 2018. It said, at the present time, the internet should not be used for the return of marked ballots. Further internet voting should not be used in the future until and unless very robust guarantees of security and verifiability are developed and in place, as no known technology guarantees the secrecy, security, and verifiability of a marked ballot transmitted over the internet. The next expert statement comes from the United States Senate Intelligence Committee. So as you know, the Russian government conducted a large-scale interference campaign against our elections in 2016, and the US Senate Intelligence Committee investigated that. They looked at disinformation on social media, but they also looked at the Russian campaign against the United States election infrastructure, and they made recommendations to protect our election infrastructure against future interference. And one of their recommendations is that, quote, states should resist pushes for online voting, unquote, and that was a bipartisan recommendation. The next expert statement comes from the 4 federal agencies that are tasked with overseeing Homeland Security and elections. Those include the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So they issued this statement in 2020. We recommend paper ballot return as electronic ballot return technologies are high risk, even with controls in place. Electronic ballot return faces significant security risks to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of voted ballots. These risks can ultimately affect the tabulation and results and can occur at scale. The final expert statement comes from a working group. This was hosted by the University of California, Berkeley. This working group is actually funded by a proponent of internet voting. The working group, however, concluded that the current cybersecurity environment and state of technology make it infeasible for the group to draft responsible standards to support the use of internet ballot return in U.S. public elections at this time. Implementing widespread adoption of secure and accessible internet ballot return requires technologies that do not currently exist and others that have not been fully tested. The working group assesses that the risks associated with nation states attacking end-user devices to impact U.S. public elections are problematically high and show no signs of declining. So that statement was issued in 2022. So the next potential disadvantage has to do with the loss of voter privacy. So an attacker could gain access to a ballot when it's in transit over the internet and view and disclose the voter's selections. So ballots returned electronically are often linked with the voter's identity. For example, fax and email attachments will include both the voter's personal information and their marked ballot. For that reason, there's a high probability that the voter's selections will be known at least to the election official who receives the ballot. For that reason, at least 22 states that allow electronic return require a voter returning a ballot electronically to sign a statement waiving their right to a secret ballot. The Federal Voting Assistance Program also requires military and overseas voters who use its facilities to return a ballot electronically to sign a waiver waiving their right to a secret ballot. And then the final potential disadvantage concerns a potential loss of public confidence in elections. So at a time when public distrust of election processes is already widespread, electronic ballot return introduces significant new risks that may further undermine public confidence. The lack of a voter-verified paper record for ballots returned electronically makes it impossible for election officials to conduct effective audits to verify that the election results are correct. In the absence of effective audits, it would be impossible to disprove false claims of fraud that are intended to undermine public confidence in elections. So I won't go into depth on these, but these are just a few case studies of potential disadvantages of electronic return. The first one comes from the state of New South Wales in Australia, which includes the city of Sydney. They had a largely online election in 2021. The system failed. Voters were not able to vote. They ended up having to nullify some of the results and rerun the elections, not using internet voting. As a result, the state abandoned internet voting and recommended paper ballots in the future. They did recommend an internet voting option limited to blind or low vision voters. The United States Postal Service actually tried to develop an internet voting system based on blockchain. It was abandoned after researchers tested the system and found that it could be hacked in multiple ways. And then in just last year in 2023 in Ecuador, voters living abroad were allowed to vote on the internet. However, the website that was used for that was targeted by denial of service attacks. Many legitimate voters were prevented from voting. The attacks originated from several nations, including Russia and China. The government ended up voiding the votes cast over the internet and ordered a new election in person rather than through internet voting. So the last part of the presentation covers potential alternatives to electronic ballot return. Before I do that, I just wanted to briefly note the things that Maryland currently does to make the absentee voting process accessible to voters with disabilities. So Maryland does allow for online ballot delivery and marking for all voters, and those systems are accessible. Not all states do that. Maryland also allows an agent to assist a voter with voting if necessary. Also, Maryland does not require signature verification for absentee ballots, which can be a barrier for voters with disabilities. So first, we're going to look at curbside voting. So this is a curbside voting station. So basically, curbside voting is allowing voters to cast ballots while in their vehicle outside a polling place. So 27 states and DC currently offer some form of curbside voting. Eligibility may be limited to the elderly, voters with disabilities, or other conditions. Maryland doesn't currently offer curbside voting. To ensure that curbside voting is accessible to voters with disabilities, you would need accessible equipment to be made available at curbside. That's a Department of Justice recommendation. And it should be feasible here because there's some large urban counties in Texas that use our exact same ballot marking device, and they do bring it out to the curb for voters with disabilities. And then another potential alternative is bringing accessible equipment into voters' homes. And that allows voters with disabilities to vote from home. It's done in Multnomah County, Oregon, which includes the city of Portland, also in San Francisco. And they basically have teams of election officials that go to voters' homes with accessible equipment like a tablet or a ballot marking device and a printer. And then the teams will bring the voted paper ballot back to the election office while preserving the secrecy of the voter's ballot. A similar program in Maryland would provide another option for voters with disabilities who may not have access to a computer or printer at home, and would allow those voters to return their voted ballots confidentially. And that is the conclusion of our presentation, Madam Chair, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was very informative. This committee will have several pieces of legislation this session where we will be taking a look at these issues, including curbside voting. And the first question I see is from Delegate Hornberger.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for compiling this information. Also want to thank all the advocates that are here today and the ones that stopped by my office. We had a lengthy discussion about it, increasing accessibility. So hats off to them. My main question was that one of the concerns that was brought up by the advocates when they visited with me was the anonymity of the ballot that they receive in the mail at their home. So ultimately, they have someone that assists them with filling out that ballot. And then after it's mailed in, there's less of a concern of anonymity because it's going to the election board or the polling location. It's being opened. There's a full process with that. It's very transparent. So my question deals with if the mail ballot is the solution to making it so that they can vote, how do you ensure the anonymity of that process in their home or wherever they're filling out that ballot? Because I know, having previously served as an election judge, we would typically have a registered D and a registered R meet with that person and then assist them in filling out the ballot to make sure that the wrong votes weren't cast or that there was some accountability there. So I didn't see that in the presentation, but very curious if you addressed that.
Sure. So Maryland allows for online ballot marking, so that can be done privately now. It's the act of mailing the ballot where there would be assistance required for voters with print disabilities. So the way that you could handle that, if you were to continue to do it by mail, would be you'd have, as you said, a bipartisan team could come to the home and not vote for them. As you said, there's a process for that in the polling place, but it wouldn't be voting for them. They would complete the ballot themselves and then deposit it in a bag or some other receptacle and bring it back to the elections office. Obviously, that's not a perfect solution, but internet ballot return has grave privacy risks. So there's a very grave privacy risk associated with electronic return, which is why the large majority of states require voters to waive their right to a secret ballot if they return electronically.
Okay, and then the follow-on question to that, if I may, do we have any idea of the size of this population?
The population with print disabilities, you mean?
Yes.
So Ben covered that. Ben, do you want to?
Yeah. So it's hard to calculate exact data for this, but looking at the American Community Survey, there was about 100,000 people with a vision disability that is captured by the American Community Survey. And then there was roughly another 100,000 with a like a self-care disability.
All right, thank you so much.
Delegate Plavkovich-Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry I missed much of the briefing. I look forward to watching the recording later. I was testifying in another committee. I'm curious about those last couple of options that were presented. Do you have any information that you can provide the committee either now or in follow-up about kind of like how many voters they're able to serve, like these other jurisdictions with either curbside or at-home voting, and just kind of what resources are maybe needed to get a program like that going at scale in a state the size of Maryland?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, and for curbside voting, it's pretty popular in a number of the states that do it. I don't have exact figures for that, but I can look for them. But especially there's some states where it's very well established and quite popular. For the bipartisan teams going to voters' homes, that's a much smaller population. I do have some numbers on that from Portland, Oregon. And as I recall, it's in the hundreds per major election, but I can get you those specific numbers. But those programs are much smaller scale. Mm-hmm.
Delegate Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question. Could you explain to us how the curbside voting would be and cars lined up and back with one another to vote?
Yes, sir. Yeah, they would. Cars would be lined up, and it would be you know, at a facility where there was enough room for a line of cars to form without impeding traffic and whatnot. I think it would probably be somewhat like the COVID testing sites, the temporary ones drive through that were set up in during that time. You know, maybe a nice tent, and then, you know, in a large parking lot or something like that.
Right.
So,
Well, the other question I have is, so what would they do? They would hand them a machine that would have to vote. So in other words, you have somebody there facilitate to hand them the equipment so they could vote inside their car.
correct. Yes, you would have election officials out at the curb, and they would check the voter in. And then they would also either hand the voter a ballot if they wanted to mark the ballot on paper, or if they wanted to use the ballot marking device, give them the ballot marking device. And our ballot marking device is definitely, it is portable. It's 16 inches by 20 inches by 17 inches and weighs 25 pounds. So it could be done to give that to someone in their car to vote on.
So and I don't want to belabor this. So if they handed me the machine, I could pick whatever I wanted and I would touch it, correct?
Right, yeah, so the ballot marking device, yeah, it's a touchscreen system, and then it prints out a paper ballot that is then counted. And so that paper ballot would be put in a receptacle like a bag or something, and then taken back into the polling place to be scanned.
Right. Thank you. One last question, if I might. I know that when you print off a ballot from your computer, when you mail that back in, or if you take it to a drop box, they cannot scan that. Am I correct?
That's right. No, those ballots that you print out at home on your home computer on regular paper, they have to be remade by election officials back at the election office on ballot paper so that it can be scanned. So that is the case with all those ballots that are printed out at home. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Any further questions from Delegate Feldmar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do you have any data as part of this? I may have missed it, but I don't think I saw it. In terms of voters with disabilities and their chosen voting methods, in terms of how many voters with disabilities go to a polling place in person and use a ballot marking device versus, you know, completing a mail-in ballot at home and having assistance in returning that?
Right. That's a great question. I know that data is available, and I can get that for you, but I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much, Stan, and your colleagues for joining us here. And you can go tell the new chair of E&T that you had a wonderful time at the best committee in the entire generals.
And Madam Chair, I just want to really thank Ben and Dominic for their excellent work on this project. It was really indispensable.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Our next speaker is J. Alex Halderman, a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan. Dr. Halderman is known nationally and internationally as an authority on electronic voting systems. He has testified before congressional committees on the issue of election security. He has published numerous peer-reviewed research papers analyzing electronic voting systems used in the United States and in other countries. He has also investigated methods for improving election security. Welcome, Dr. Halderman, and we look forward to your remarks.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the committee for allowing me to be here today. Before I begin, let me just say first that it was excellent to get to see that presentation from the staff. I think it's a wonderful overview of what is known about this topic, and I just want to endorse what I just heard as within what the current scientific consensus on this issue is. Also, I'd like to add that although I'm going to testify about the security risks that are facing internet voting systems, I'm extremely sympathetic to the needs of my fellow citizens who are in the armed services or who have disabilities that provide real challenges to their participating in elections. And so I'd also like to endorse those alternatives to casting ballots online that we heard about from the staff. Systems such as curbside voting or bringing voting equipment to voters' homes that are being used in other states today provide an alternative that can help to address those needs without the grave security risks that I'm about to talk to you about. I've prepared a presentation that discusses threats raised by internet voting systems, a bit more about how they fall into the context of elections, and goes through some case studies in a bit more detail so you can see how those risks have played out in the real world. So if I could have the first slide, please. All right, thank you. Next slide. Just a little bit more about me before we begin. I am the Brett Family Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Michigan, and my work generally tries to apply science and technology to make elections more secure and more trustworthy. I've participated in studies that have analyzed the security of not only internet voting systems, but election systems generally in the US and other countries around the world. And I've testified about threats to internet voting and in-person voting to the US Senate and House. I work frequently in collaboration with election officials, including I serve as the co-chair of the Michigan Secretary of State's Election Security Advisory Commission. Next slide. So I'd like to step back for a moment from the immediate question of voting online and talk about the risk profile that elections face today. Because there are really two major categories of security-related risks that our elections face. First, there's a real risk of hacking. And we saw this most famously during the 2016 election cycle, when we now know, thanks to subsequent bipartisan federal investigations, that attackers linked to the Russian government attempted to target election-related infrastructure in all 50 states, including Maryland. Now, At the same time, we have another category of risks. So not real attacks, but false claims of election fraud by computer. And we saw this kind of claim propagated after the 2020 election by people like Sidney Powell and Mike Lindell, who have made utterly baseless and technically incoherent claims that election results were changed by hacking. So it takes a little bit of mental work to separate these. There are very real risks of attacks against election systems, but then also people who are actively misleading voters and perpetrating hoaxes upon the public that are just drawing on the possibility of things being wrong in elections to claim that there was actual fraud in the absence of evidence. Both of these kinds of risks are ones that everybody in the election sector, in the public sector working in elections, in the research community working on elections, is worried about all the time. And our election systems need to be designed, and the legislation supporting them needs to be aware of both of these kinds of risks so that they can be mitigated. Next slide, please. So how do we address these risks in traditional elections in the polling place? Well, our challenge is to make elections that are both trustworthy and trusted by the public, using technology that is fundamentally limited in the security it can provide. So in order to accomplish that, the best practice is to seek to design elections that can provide the public affirmative evidence that results are accurate. And we can do that using paper ballots, which are a record of the vote that can't later be changed in a cyber attack, coupled with risk-limiting audits, in which officials inspect enough of the ballots to demonstrate to the public that the outcome is correct. At the same time, to protect privacy, to ensure availability on election day, it's crucial to keep attackers as far away from the equipment running the election as possible. And to do that, our best tool is to ensure that voting systems aren't connected to the internet. That also is just one of the messages from election officials that we hear frequently that I think is most reassuring to the public. The voting system is not connected to the internet. So there's been significant progress really on all of these fronts since 2016 and the Russian attacks, and especially since 2020. But we have more work to do. But at the same time, internet voting, we're hearing about internet voting today. That is something that is fundamentally incompatible with all of these critical security defenses, with paper ballots, because you no longer have a paper ballot coming all the way back from the voter, with risk-limiting audits, because you can't get an effective audit with a record that has been changed before the ballot was recorded. And essentially with keeping election systems from being connected to the internet, because an internet voting system must be available to the public. So this is why introducing internet voting weakens security, both for people who vote online and for everyone else, since the votes that are cast through that online system become a weak point, an Achilles heel of the election system broadly. Next slide. So the staff presentation already went over some of these excellent sources that reflect the expert consensus on internet voting, but I'd just like to reiterate these three. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in 2018 released a consensus report, their strongest form of policy guidance, that says no known technology guarantees the secrecy, security, and verifiability of a marked ballot transmitted over the internet. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the Election Assistance Commission, the FBI, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology issued a joint assessment in 2020 that says securing the return of voted ballots via the internet while ensuring ballot integrity and maintaining voter privacy is difficult, if not impossible, at this time. Finally, the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Association for Computing Machinery, two of the leading scientific professional organizations, issued a statement in 2023, just last year, that says we write to caution unequivocally that internet voting is not a secure solution in any form, nor will it be in the foreseeable future. And I'd like to point out that these statements talk about voting over the internet or internet voting. Experts use the term internet voting to refer to all forms of ballot transmission over the internet, including the electronic ballot return methods we're talking about today in this hearing. So this is the overwhelming scientific consensus. The scientific community, I think, realizes or recognizes that there would be wonderful benefits if we were able to return ballots online while guaranteeing the integrity of the election and the privacy of the voters. But that just, we do not know how to do that with available technology today. Next slide. So why is that? What are some of the security risks that face internet voting systems? Well, those can be divided into threats that are facing the client side of that process, that is the voter's device, and threats that are faced by the server side, that is whatever internet connected system is accepting the ballots. On the client side, necessarily in an internet voting system, there has to be some software or some data that's being provided from a device that the voter controls. That is one that the voter ultimately would be responsible for securing and managing. And that presents a challenge because, of course, we know that there are a vast number of internet security threats facing users, and even users like all of you on the committee, presumably, who have devices that are professionally managed by your IT staff, face serious risks. Voters who are part of the general public using devices that they own and manage themselves are in an even more difficult position. So what are those threats? Users' devices, whether laptops or home computers, frequently are infected with malicious software, things like spyware or bots, that can either violate their privacy or remotely make changes to data that they're providing, such as the votes that they're inputting to an online application. Client-side malicious software can also steal credentials like passwords that voters use to access their account, and voters can be directed to imposter sites, end up logging in, entering their credentials the wrong place, and allowing them to be stolen by an attacker. You also have in a remote internet voting situation a greater risk that the voter is going to be coerced into voting a way that they don't desire because they're not voting within the safety of the polling place. Internet voting systems have threats on the server side too, the most prominent of which, of course, is remote hacking. That the server, whatever system is providing that internet voting service, has to withstand attacks potentially from anywhere in the world, including from some of the world's most well-resourced and sophisticated attackers, such as foreign governments. At the same time, an internet voting system needs to withstand what are called insider attacks. That is, attacks by the people running, operating, and maintaining the service. Usually these services are outsourced to third-party companies, many of which then go on to host them in the cloud through additional third parties. The server has to withstand supply chain attacks, where an adversary tries to alter either the hardware or the software components before they're assembled to make that server. That's a very, very difficult problem facing all sorts of critical infrastructure today. And lastly, the server needs to withstand denial of service attacks, where the service goes offline because an attacker has done something to interfere with access to it. That's another very difficult problem. So among these problems are some of the biggest open challenges in security today. cybersecurity broadly, we don't have great answers to questions like how do you secure servers from hacking or clients from malware, or how do you remotely authenticate users in a high-risk situation? How do you prevent denial of service? We can partly address some of these challenges, but we're a long way from being able to provide the level of assurance that people demand from their elections. So just to draw one comparison, about why voting may be more difficult than other problems that we address with online technology today. We could compare it to online banking or online commerce. So the secret ballot is part of what makes voting just so much harder than banking or shopping online, because we can't just send every voter a receipt that says how they voted, or, well, they could use that to sell their vote, or someone could use that receipt to coerce them into voting a way they didn't want. But even then, comparing to online commerce, losses to online payment fraud every year, according to some sources, are $300 billion globally. I'm not sure how many lost votes we can tolerate in elections, but the magnitude and the risk tolerance is very, very different than what we tolerate in payments. In payments, we can just chalk up some of that as the cost of doing business. Not so in elections. Next slide. So I'd like to just briefly go through some case studies to give you a sense of what problems have arisen with online voting systems that have been fielded. The first is about a system called Votes, which was a blockchain-based voting app for mobile phones that was formerly used by West Virginia. In 2020, researchers from MIT studied this application and found flaws that would allow attackers to alter ballots cast through it, to learn how people voted, and perhaps most disturbingly to me, to even determine the sensitive geographic locations where military service members were stationed, which is something that the military in certain operational contexts needs to keep secret. But that was exposed to third parties through this app. The broader point about blockchain voting in general that I'd like to make is that blockchain technology, although promising for some applications, it solves the problem of stolen votes about as well as Bitcoin solves the problem of stolen money. In other words, it doesn't. Safely voting online requires more than just having a cryptographic ledger like a blockchain. It requires solving the problem of casting votes securely from untrusted and potentially compromised user devices. It requires solving the problem of defending servers against nation-state attackers. And it requires securely authenticating voters. Blockchain technology doesn't address any of these problems. Next slide, please. Another widely used platform another platform that some states are using for voting online today is from a company called Democracy Live. So many states are using Democracy Live's website today to allow voters to print ballots and return them by mail, as Maryland does, which is a relatively safe application of internet technologies for making voting work better. However, a few states are using essentially the same Democracy Live online service to allow voters to vote online completely without returning anything through a paper-based channel. This introduces a number of serious threats that I identified in a peer-reviewed study in 2021. So we asked whether different categories of attackers could violate voter privacy or could invisibly change votes with the Democracy Live system architecture. So malware that was present on a voter's device with Democracy Live could violate voter privacy and could invisibly change votes. An attacker who compromised Democracy Live's services through a hack or a supply chain attack or an insider attack could also violate voter privacy, could also invisibly change votes. Perhaps most interestingly, the Democracy Live architecture also relies on a number of third-party companies in order to perform critical functions of the voting app. And these third parties also could potentially violate voter privacy or invisibly change votes. And this includes Google, Amazon, and Cloudflare. So we know there are people, for instance, today who don't trust, say, the Washington Post as a neutral standard of journalism, in part because it's owned by Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos. Well, if Amazon, the company, you can imagine where this would go, is also in a position where it can violate voters' privacy or change their votes invisibly. That's just incredible fodder for election-related concerns, even in the absence of an attack with a system that's architected this way. Next slide, please. All right, well, we heard a little bit about elections and online voting in Estonia from the staff presentation. Estonia was the first country to use internet voting nationwide, and it allows voters to install an app on their devices that lets them cast ballots through the internet. But the key thing about Estonia's approach is it's based around a security chip that is in every citizen's national ID card, which is able to sign the ballots and encrypt them in a secure way. In the US, the only significant population of voters that has a comparable kind of ID card is military service members. So I was part of the first peer-reviewed independent security assessment of the Estonian system, which we published in 2014. And we went to Estonia and assessed the software and the process security that goes around it and found numerous substandard security practices. To give you just one anecdote, we found that the computer system that was being used to prepare this software and distribute it for every Estonian voter to install on their own computers was somebody's personal laptop that had gambling software and pirated media installed on it. So this is far below the standard you would expect for security in a critical system. After our rigorous assessment, we concluded that Estonia's technology was, even with the security chips, unlikely to withstand a concerted attack from a nation-state adversary such as Russia. Next slide. Another case study, Australia. So in 2015, in Australia, the state of New South Wales conducted an election, I should say, that was at the time the largest ever use of online voting. About 280,000 people cast their votes through a website that the New South Wales state government in Australia deployed. During that election, a colleague of mine, Vanessa Teague, who is an academic in Australia, discovered flaws in the New South Wales online voting system that would allow attackers to inject malicious software into voters' browsers and silently change their votes. Since we discovered this during the election, we immediately informed officials, and they were able to correct the problem, but not until after more votes were cast in a number of contests than the margin of victory. So it wouldn't be possible to go back and see whether problems like this were also discovered by real attackers and exploited. And unfortunately, that limits the amount of certainty we can have that the election results were correctly decided. Now, more recently, and this was mentioned in the staff presentation, in December 2019, the New South Wales internet voting system crashed on election day at 8:30 in the morning. And didn't really come back up at all during the election. This disenfranchised tens of thousands of voters. And it, by all accounts, it was not because of an attack. It was just a mistake, an error in the design of the system. But this shows how fragile this technology can be. If your voters are relying on an online system to cast their votes, and there is a significant glitch, whether artificial or as a result of human error or malicious, well, that can leave voters who haven't had time to prepare with no alternative, no other way to take part in that election. And in Australia, for that reason, the Supreme Court ordered new elections in 3 electoral contests as a result of this problem. They had to toss out the entire election result for those contests. And the government has since announced that it's going to abandon their previous internet voting system, and they're studying what to do next, but they've said they're not going to introduce anything new until 2027 at the earliest. Next slide, please. Finally, one more case study. This comes from some of my own research at Michigan. So during the 2010 general election, Washington, D.C., the district government, launched an internet voting system for overseas voters. And they were one of the first US jurisdictions to do this. And before they started using the system, they did something that is essentially unique in the US experience. They decided to hold a mock election and invite anyone from the public who wanted to try to hack into it to do so. And this was their way of attempting to harden the system and perhaps ask the scientific community to justify their claims that such systems were going to be fragile. Well, it's not every day that you are invited to hack into government computers without going to jail. So my students and I took them up on this offer. And in just 48 hours, we had hacked in and changed all the votes. And the problem was a very simple one. The problem was simply that on one line in the tens of thousands of lines of computer source code, the programmer had used double quotation marks instead of single quotation marks, as shown here on the screen. That was enough to allow us to change all the votes for reasons that are technical. But I'd add that not only did we change all the votes, but we also decided to use this as an opportunity to test what election officials would do to recover for such a problem. Instead of calling Washington, D.C. and telling them what happened, we just waited to see if they'd discovered the problem. And after a couple of days, when they hadn't yet discovered it, we decided to leave a calling card for them. So we modified the website so that after every voter voted, their computer would start playing the Michigan football fight song. It was only after that that the election officials discovered anything was wrong, and that was about 2 days after the attack. And ultimately, they had no means of recovering the original votes because we had changed all of the digital records, and there were no paper records to back them up. And that's the sort of situation, the nightmare situation you could find yourselves in with such a system. Next slide. So I don't want to be entirely doom and gloom about this. I want to mention at least briefly that there are prospects someday for providing better security for voting online through additional scientific development. There is a technology called end-to-end verification that aspires to allow every voter to confirm that their vote was correctly cast and counted using certain forms of advanced cryptography. And after about almost 3 decades of development, this technology is now being piloted through an effort called Election Guard that is operated by Microsoft. They've been working to build end-to-end verification as an added layer of security for elections conducted using paper ballots. But that's the key part, as an added layer of security for elections with paper ballots. It's an active research question whether end-to-end verification can someday also help secure online voting to the level of security and privacy that voters and the public demand. We don't know the answer to that yet, but it's promising. But Microsoft has never endorsed the use of Election Guard for internet voting because of the fundamental technical challenges that internet voting faces. And that's a quote from Josh Benelo, the principal founder of Election Guard at Microsoft. Next slide. So I'll wrap up. I just want to say that expanding internet voting or allowing significant groups to cast their ballots online, unfortunately, with current technology, simply going to magnify risks to election security, both the risks of serious hacking and the risks of false claims. There's a broad scientific consensus, almost universal, that internet voting can't be secured with available technology today. And it's unfortunate that some states aren't currently following the science on this issue. Connecting voting systems to the internet greatly magnifies the risk of hacking. The more voters vote online, the more attractive a target the online voting system becomes. Even absent an attack, internet voting is highly vulnerable to false claims of fraud, and scientists may not be able to defend the outcome's legitimacy if there are enough votes cast through an online voting system to make a difference in who won. I hope that someday research will make it possible to secure online voting, but that's going to require solving some of the major open problems in cybersecurity. So my assessment is that that's likely to be a decade or more in the future if we get there. All right, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Halderman. That was very, very informative. I would just ask, as we're waiting to get your face back on the screen here, if you could provide the PowerPoint to the committee, that would be really helpful to all of us. So thank you. First question is from Delegate Chow Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Professor, thank you very much for sharing this with us. It seems really scary in terms of voting by internet. At the same time, I have a question for you. It's more like which one is safer, but a lot of people do online banking. They are facing similar issues as well, right?
Yes.
A lot of people actually trust it as well. How do you think, where is the point people trust our online voting compared to online banking?
Well, probably everybody knows someone who has lost money to online payment fraud, or had their credit card numbers stolen from a website, or had someone hack into their bank account and steal money. It's just pervasive that online fraud in banking is there. But with money, there are two things that make it different. We can give you a receipt so that you can prove the transaction took place. And if someone has stolen money from you, especially as a consumer, we can usually just reverse that fraud. So you don't have to worry about it all that much. But secondly, as a financial system as a whole, well, we can write off some level of that fraud as the cost of doing business, because, well, having perfect security for online commerce would mean you weren't going to have a lot of commerce at all. So I think voting is very different on all of those fronts. We can't give you a receipt because that's going to let you prove to someone else how you voted, and potentially someone can coerce you into saying, unless you bring a receipt that shows you voted for my candidate, I'm going to fire you, or I'm going to do something else horrible to you. But moreover, we just can't write off a certain fraction of votes being stolen or election votes being wrongly decided as the cost of running a democracy. We just can't measure the harm and the damage that does.
Thank you.
Delegate Feldmark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate all the information, and I appreciate that you opened with sensitivity to the problem we're trying to solve here, right? And recognizing that we may not currently have a perfect solution, but that that's not okay either, right? So I have two sort of lines of questions, but they're short lines, Madam Chair, I promise. On one area, if you can just say more about the use of end-to-end verification for increasing security with the use of paper ballots. I was interested in can you just explain more about that?
Yes. So the Election Guard project, what it's aiming to do is integrate technology into ballot marking devices and ballot scanners in polling places that gives the voter another way to know that their individual ballot has been recorded correctly and included in the total. And what that consists of is essentially an encrypted receipt that you can't use to prove how you voted to anyone else, but that you can, through a certain process, use to prove to yourself that your vote is actually represented in it, And then you can go and make sure through a certain process that that receipt is included in the total votes counted. So if it sounds a little bit complicated and confusing, that's because it is. That's one of the things that is an open research problem. It's making this into something that people without a degree in cryptography or computer science can understand and use as a basis for confidence. But it's a kind of mathematical proof that your vote was correctly included in the totals.
Okay. Thank you. I may need to do a little more brushing up on my cryptography. So the other slide I wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper into, you talked about the client side threats versus the server side threats. And you mentioned a number of different platforms for online voting. I guess I'm trying to understand sort of the simplest, what my understanding of what voters with print disabilities are asking for is Maryland already allows for electronic delivery. We already allow for electronic marking of that ballot. And then it has to be printed on paper and mailed back in, right? So if the electronic delivery and the electronic marking don't pose a security threat, it's simply the electronic return of that marked ballot, correct? Am I understanding correctly?
So the electronic delivery of the blank ballot or the marking and then return through the mail is less of a threat. There are no cyber risks. There are still some risks associated with that, but the degree of risk is less. And the reason for that is the voter has an ability to hold and review that printed ballot and then know what it is that the election officials are going to receive from them. When the ballot is returned through an online mechanism, it's possible for software in the voter's computer or on that server to alter the ballot before it's counted. So that's the difference in the kind of risk. And I realize that there are challenges for voters with print disabilities in even verifying a printed ballot that they have with them. Although I do know that many voters with such disabilities do have their own assistive devices that they can use to read printed text, such as a ballot that came out of that system.
Right. So I guess I'm just trying to understand if that electronically received and electronically marked ballot, instead of being printed physically, I'm going to use a low-tech example. There may be a more secure option, I'm sure, but printed to PDF. Okay. And that ballot was returned by email. I know it's still not secure. I'm not saying that, but what I want to understand is, in terms of the server side threats you were referring to, is that, I mean, it seems to me like at that point there's really no server side threat, but I may be wrong. So that's what I'm.
Oh, I see. Well, there is still the email service that is being used, but there are now two email services, one that the voter is using and one that the election officials are using, which could potentially be avenues through which the ballot was changed before it was received and counted. So we in the security community generally considers internet return to be a form of online voting, although the risks, the specific risks you'd have to assess within the scope of a particular deployment.
Okay, so if the ballot were received and like a ballot that is received electronically, completed by hand, printed, completed by hand and mailed back, the Board of Elections then has to complete a ballot to be scanned, right?
You're talking about the duplication function. Yes, so when the ballot, I'm sorry, actually, Delegate, I don't understand your question. I think I missed some key part of it.
Sure. So currently with mail-in ballots and electronic delivery, right, the ballot can be delivered to the voter electronically. The voter completes it, either completes it electronically and prints it out, or prints it out and completes it by hand, right? And then mails that paper ballot back to the Board of Elections. The Board of Elections then has to open that ballot and manually complete an official ballot to be scanned, right? Because the ballot that the voter printed is just 8.5 by 11 paper from their printer. It's not scannable in the proper format, right? So
yes, generally something has to be done to remake the ballot if it's coming back and having been printed off of a home computer.
And so as long as that's happening, the election system, right, the voting system is not experiencing any new exposure. There's still the issues of is the ballot actually accurate, and was it, somehow changed or distorted as it was, intercepted in the email process. I want to set that aside for a second. I just want to understand the sort of the voting system itself. Is there any exposure in that scenario? I understand. But I want to ask.
Yes, I understand now. Yes, so the bright line here is that the voted ballots from the voter's hand all the way through to the time they're counted are not traveling through the internet in that scenario. So the voter has a chance to see that original piece of paper that has their vote on it, and it goes all the way to counting. And that's where you're getting that defense that the voting system in a very strict sense isn't connected to the internet. Maybe some of the way you're distributing blank ballots is, but the voter still has a chance to see their exact marks and how they're represented on the piece of paper, whether directly or through some personal accessibility device that they may have access to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Fair, then Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for the moment, for the question. My question's two parts, but I think I'm just going to put both parts out there and let you kind of touch on them. They touch right on your 2010 ethical hacking adventure that you went through. And I wanted to see, by part one of the question was just simply, you identified one line of code and one specific challenge, a double quotation instead of a single quotation. Had that been properly laid out, did you identify any other potential security risks inside that code that could have been exploited? And then the second part of that question is for states that are considering, including Maryland, as we're considering potential options for communities, especially communities with disabilities that might need access to this option. Can you speak to whether the state should be looking at investing in ethical hacking, opportunities like this, and reaching out to organizations to attempt to force hack our systems to find areas of vulnerability?
Right. The great questions. Thank you very much. In 2010, the vulnerability that we discovered was something that took us less than 24 hours to find. And we didn't really spend more time than that penetration testing or the penetration testing the DC system, since that was basically outside the scope of the public challenge and our responsibilities. We did, however, in just that amount of time, find an entirely different route into the system that probably would have worked even in the absence of that bug with the quotation marks, which was that there were other pieces of network equipment within the scope of the security review where the officials deploying the network had forgotten to change the default passwords. And so we were able to get access to essentially the core network routers and other equipment running the election, the online voting network. That could have given us another way to potentially reroute voters' online votes, steal their credentials, and change the ballots that were ultimately submitted. So yes, there was potentially a second path within just what we had found in 24 hours. Now, generally, is penetration testing a good idea? Yes, it's a very, very good idea to do penetration testing, but you have to acknowledge its limitations, which is in any kind of penetration test, what you get out of it is going to depend on the time, the skill, and even the luck of the people who are doing that testing. So the more eyes on a system, generally the better, other than for certain things that really do need to remain secret in order to maintain their security. But it's no guarantee that your testers are going to find all of the vulnerabilities that an attacker might seek to exploit, especially an attacker like a nation state that can bring tremendous resources to bear on trying to compromise your system.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much, Dr. Halderman. This was a really informative presentation. And I just wanted to, I was thinking that one of the most compelling, I think, reasons for electronic return of the ballot is the fact that so many states, several states are doing this and have done it. And I know we've reviewed a little bit in terms of the states that are already doing this. And so given your presentation, I just wanted to really hone in on that. Are these states just hoping for the best? Do they know something that we all don't know? So if you can just comment on that, certainly the number of states that are doing this is something that's on my mind.
Well, yes, I think one of the factors that's driving that is that, frankly, there's a limited amount of expertise to go around on this subject. There are the scientific community that works in elections and the number of people who study elections in detail is limited, and state governments are not all taking the time and care that yours has to have a staff, a group of staff do such detailed research before making such a decision. So I think there may be a lack of good information getting to the right places that is a certain factor in it. Also, many of these states adopted rules that allow internet voting before the threats were as clear as they are today. That is before the 2016 and the 2020 election cycles, when both real hacking and election misinformation and false claims of fraud became so prominent and such obvious risks to our elections. So I think that's a second factor involved in why so many states have these policies now. It's a lot easier to, it's a lot more difficult, I think, to go backwards once voters already have an expectation that this is going to be an option available to them. It's a lot harder to explain why it can no longer be than to have to explain that we don't know yet how to build a system that is adequately strong. I would just add that, unfortunately, the more states adopt internet voting, the more both of those hacking risks, both the hacking risk and the false claims of fraud risk, compound, right? These risks compound because there are only a few software platforms that are used prominently by states. They become a risk that an attack against these platforms could alter votes in several states. Also, simply the net number of votes that are being cast through these systems, as that grows, they become a greater and greater potential target, because an attacker, of course, doesn't want to bother with a target that isn't necessarily going to affect any election outcomes, except to the extent that that might be useful for sowing doubt. So I think that's probably what concerns me most. Not that there are any votes being cast online, but that the number seems to be growing, and that when it reaches the point that the votes cast through such systems could have made a difference in a major national election, I can guarantee you that doubts over whether votes cast over the internet actually made it through unaltered are going to be a major point of contention by people who want to cast doubt on the credibility of the election result.
We have one more question, Delegate Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. After listening to this briefing, thank you so much for all this information. Question come to mind. We have electronic poll books that we use. Have you looked into the security of those and what possibilities could be, the risk to using these new electronic poll books? And I believe we're actually looking to buying new ones. And I know I keep hearing a common theme that every time you hook into the internet, that's another way for hackers to get in and steal information and do whatever they want to do. Have you ever looked at the electronic poll books, and do you have opinion on those?
Yes, so I have thought about electronic poll books quite a bit, including in the context of the electronic poll book system that Michigan uses, which is something that the state developed in-house here. And I won't comment on any specific model or brand of that technology, but I can give you some general thoughts, which is first of all, the poll books necessarily do have some path to the internet because we like to do things like online voter registration, and ultimately that data about who's registered generally does touch some database that's internet accessible. The key is making sure that the poll books don't hook up directly into the system that also is computing your election results, because that gives you that separation between election-related components that are online versus ones that aren't. I think it's best practice to make sure your poll books can operate on election day, at least, without internet access, because it would be a catastrophe, of course, if someone hacked into them simply to make them not work during the election. And a number of states do run poll books in that mode where they are networked for early voting, where you need to track right away that someone's voted to make sure that they don't go and vote again at some other site. But those poll books are then put into an offline mode on election day when in the states I'm talking about, a voter can only vote in one location. It's important also to make sure with poll books that you have some backup method available in case there is a problem with those computers. And some states require there to be a printed voter list as a fallback if the electronic list or poll books fail. I think that's a very sensible kind of resilience. You're still going to have long lines if you are going by a paper list instead of an electronic list, but at least you won't have to shut down the polling place entirely as you would if you had no means whatsoever of checking in voters.
I guess my last question would be, maybe I want to make sure it's perfectly clear. So the voters poll book, the electronic poll books, when they're connected to the internet, are they vulnerable to people stealing information from those as far as voter information, voter ID, and things of that nature? And, I'm just curious what your opinion. I think you might have answered some of it, but I'm just trying to make sure I'm perfectly clear because it is pretty important to privacy issues.
They need to be hardened against those threats as well as possible. But that's a circumstance in which some components of voter registration do necessarily need to be maintained in networked systems in order to conduct the election functions, like allow voters to view and change their registration records online. So there have in the past been very serious vulnerabilities with online voter registration or online voter database systems. That was something that the 2016 Russian attackers did manage to break into voter registration systems. I believe in multiple states was the finding of the Intelligence Committee, and in at least one state, they even had the ability to change records, but there is no evidence that they did. So that would be the voter registration related hacking, to be perfectly clear, is a threat that we have to deal with by hardening those systems as well as possible. But ultimately, what it can do is cause chaos on election day of a visible kind when people are turned away from polling places because the the voter registration system isn't working or their names aren't on the list, it would be highly visible. What it can't do is invisibly change the election outcome to any significant degree, the way potentially hacking the ballots cast through an internet voting system could, if there were enough of them to affect the result.
Thank you very much. I'll tell you, I've learned a lot here today. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your questions.
Dr. Halderman, thank you very much for taking the time to brief the Ways and Means Committee. We appreciate your expertise and your taking the time to help us out here in Maryland. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. So committee, next, we will have someone who is definitely not a stranger to this committee, Jared Demarinis, our State Administrator of Elections, and he will give his perspective on the issue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I just want to basically touch on my last experience with internet voting, and that was the 2023 election in Estonia. I was fortunate enough to observe that election over there. Maryland has a sister state program with Estonia, and it was a part of that program that I was able to observe this election at the invitation of their government. Just wanted to, you've heard a lot now about Estonia on this here. It has been they do use internet voting. Their population for eligible voters is under 1 million people. I just want to, this is a very small group of individuals here. It is, has, I would say, a country that is about the size of, I think, Rhode Island or so. It's not a huge country, and it has a very small population. The other portion about this is that the March election, all 101 seats for the parliament were up, and internet voting took place for about a week, which was from February 27th through March 3rd of 2023. Internet voting has been present in the country since 2005, and on average has seen a 4% growth rate from every election moving forward. This last election, the voters, 51% of the voters voted online for it. This was the first time ever since its introduction that over 50% of the electorate did vote using iVoting. And since the introduction of iVoting, there has been gradual disappearances of who iVoters are over there from age, income, education, language, and gender. And it takes about an average of 90 seconds for a voter to log on and to start the process to casting their ballot. Overall, they have said that it's kind of, it doesn't really affect turnout as much as one would think. And it has, the only thing that they've, in their, studies over in Estonia, when I was getting briefed, was that iVoters seem to likely vote again. They have a higher retention rate. And one of the bigger things here is that trust in iVoting is high in that country, 70% trust voting there, and only a small group do not. The trust is basically based upon party choice, and it is a polarizing factor in that last election there. It was a huge issue there. Let me just say this here. This is also a completely different type of system that is unique to the world. This country, when they became independent, had no legacy systems. They developed their entire country based upon this concept of digitalization, and that each person then owns their own data. This is something that is completely different than coming into America. And each, when they have that ID card that the last presenter showed, that basically shows every aspect of their entire lives in there. They have so you can go in, they do banking, they do their health care through this, everything. When we were getting a presentation from a person, she was looking up her grade school records online right then and there through this. And then they have an audit, which then said, you had hit the school database to get your grades. So everything was, trackable, and it was, you own your own data, which is completely different. And it is a nationwide, that basically security. So one of the things that when we always asked was about hacking, like, well, aren't you afraid of hacking on this line here? They were like, if you get hacked, basically, you know everything about every one of these 1 million people. You'd be able to access all their bank account information all at the exact same time. And no one database has all the data. Even for elections in and of itself, there was 7 different databases that has to then pull together everything at the exact same time in order for you to vote. So you go in there. The other portion of this is the online voting, just to let you know, in order to prevent some voter coercion or the secrecy of the ballot, a voter is allowed to vote as many times as they want to, and that only the last vote then is counted. So they had people that were voting 13 times to see it. Another person tried to crash the system by voting twice at the exact same time into the system there. These were not double votes or any sort of voter fraud, because the person that was doing this was affecting their own data. So it wasn't voting in for another person there. And the canvas is completely different as well, just to let you know. This is, I witnessed a canvas. I've witnessed many canvases. What you had was about 3 hours of in a room where they took a air-gapped computer out with special keys then, which was divided amongst 13 people. Only 9 were active. They didn't know which one were the 9, so you couldn't necessarily get it. There was a screen like this. And then once they got the keys to get all the data to come in, they were typing up code that was them online there, at which point they just kept on typing in code, explaining what was going on. They separated the ballots from the individuals, re-scrambled the ballots all through computer programs. After that process, they then had to go through and make sure that there was no ballots from the same person more than once, and that it was only the last ballot was counted. Because you still had the option of actually voting in person, they had to then check all the voter rolls for the in-person voting, make sure that that no one had cast an in-person ballot at the time, and they had to check all that off. At the end, then they let the program run and it spit out results, and that was it. After they get sworn in from the election, all the computers, all the records are then destroyed. There is no anything else for this. That's the Estonia model. One of the things was when we went there was that I would say that a lot of the Estonians that were a part of that was very friendly. They were very, I would say, proud of their model. This is something that they take national pride in with it, but it is something that even they believe that cannot be duplicated in other places, just because of where they started from and how they evolved. And one of the things that they said was why we think that it has a high success rate and trust factor is because when they became an independent country, when they regained their independence, that they, with the digitalization, that they started with the education at a very young age, and now as those kids were getting older from the 90s, the trust in this system is there. So that's kind of the overall. I just wanted to give you that Estonia model is very unique. It's a great case study, lovely country, very cold, but not necessarily something that can be duplicated here in the current format. So just wanted to put that there.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Demarinis? I think the committee's all questioned out.
Good. I like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for
Okay,
coming
thank you.
today. Committee, thank you. That concludes today's briefing on electronic ballot returns. And I will see all the subcommittee chairs in about 5 minutes in the back. Thank you.